My name is Nora Whitfield, and I'm 35 years old. It was Christmas dinner when my mother raised her glass, scanned the table, and announced that my sister had just closed on her dream house. Then she turned to me with a rehearsed smile and said the room was still waiting on me to catch up. My sister smirked into her wine and asked, in front of everyone, when I was finally going to settle down. Every face turned toward me the way people turn toward the family's unfinished project. What none of them knew was that I had already built an entire life they'd never once bothered to visit, and that the plain manila envelope tucked inside my coat held the one number my mother had spent 13 years praying nobody would ever say out loud. Welcome back to Quiet Reckonings, where the calmest person at the table is usually the one holding the truth, and where the people who spent years underestimating her finally have to sit still and hear it. If you love stories about earned dignity and boundaries that were a long time coming, drop a comment and subscribe so you never miss the moment the whole room goes silent. Now let me walk you through exactly how it happened. The morning of that dinner started the way all my good mornings start, at 4:30, in a kitchen that smells like yeast and cold air. I own Bramblewood Bakery and Orchard, a low stone building at the end of a gravel lane, with 28 acres of fruit trees behind it. I bake before sunrise because dough doesn't care how tired you are, and I've always liked things that don't need managing, only tending. My husband Ethan was already out in the equipment shed, tightening a hinge that had worked loose overnight. We had a dozen wholesale orders to finish and a market stall to load before 7. None of it was glamorous. All of it was mine, every board, every debt paid, every early hour. Somewhere in the last decade, I'd picked up a habit that quietly reshaped my whole life. I stopped explaining myself to people who'd already made up their minds about who I was. It saved me a lot of breath. It also cost me something I didn't notice until it was almost too late, because silence, I eventually learned, is its own kind of permission, and I'd been handing it out for years without meaning to. My family believed I sold pastries off a folding table on weekends. They believed I was drifting, unmarried, unserious, the daughter who'd taken the scenic route into a ditch. And I let them believe it, because it was easier than fighting for a version of myself they'd never agreed to see. The invitation arrived the way my mother's invitations always did, wrapped in warmth with a hook inside. She called on a Tuesday, her voice bright as a bell. "Everyone's coming for Christmas, sweetheart. Your sister has wonderful news, and it wouldn't feel complete without you." I stood beside the walk-in cooler and let the silence stretch, because I already knew what wonderful news meant. A stage, and me as furniture on it. "I'll think about it," I said. "Oh, don't be like that. Family is family." When I hung up, Ethan was in the doorway with 2 mugs of coffee, and he'd heard enough to guess the rest. "You don't have to go," he said, handing me one and waiting, the way he always does. "I know, but if I skip it, she gets to tell everyone I couldn't be bothered. If I go, she gets to tell everyone I'm still a mess. There's no version where I come out ahead." He thought about that. "Then go if you want, just don't hand them a knife." I could attend and still keep the door to my real life shut, smile, eat the ham, admire the news, and drive home to my own bed. So I said yes, and told myself it would be like every other year. A few uncomfortable hours playing the cautionary tale, then quiet again. I had no idea the script was about to break wide open in my hands. That dinner didn't come from nowhere. It came from a narrative my family had rehearsed for far longer than that one phone call. I was the younger daughter, 3 years behind my sister, Vanessa, and somewhere in my first decade of life, the family settled on its verdict. Vanessa was the sensible one. I was the dreamer, never a compliment in my mother's mouth. When I was 20 and told my parents I wanted to open a bakery, my mother laughed, not cruelly, just with total certainty, the way you laugh at a child who says she wants to be a mermaid. "That's a hobby, sweetheart, not a future." My father folded his napkin and said nothing, which was essentially his entire role whenever my mother was speaking. Vanessa went to a respectable college, married a man named Marcus with a good title at a better firm, and did everything in the exact order my mother had drawn up for her. I went to work at a roadside produce stand for minimum wage and learned how to make a pie crust people drove 40 minutes for. Money in our family only ever flowed one direction. Cash for Vanessa's tuition, her wedding, her first apartment debt. Opposite, for me, there was advice, plenty of it, and a gentle reminder that I'd made my own bed. I stopped asking for help while I was still young. I told myself it was pride. Looking back, it was survival, because asking and being turned down had started to feel like paying to be reminded of my place. So I built quietly, one morning at a time, and let my mother keep her tidy little story. I just didn't know yet how expensive that story would become. The last time I asked my mother for anything, I was 23, and I'd done my homework. I'd found a small storefront downtown, empty a year because the roof needed work, which is why it was cheap. I'd written a real business plan, projected costs, a repayment schedule I'd checked 3 times. The bank would lend to me, but only with a cosigner since I was young and my credit was thin. So I sat at my mother's kitchen table and laid it all out, clean and careful. She read it. She actually read every page, which gave me hope for about 90 seconds. Then she slid the folder back across the table and folded her hands. "We can only afford to believe in one of you," she said. That was the whole answer, not "we can't afford it." Not "the numbers worry me." Just that one sentence, delivered like a closing argument. I remember the clock ticking, the smell of her coffee, and deciding right there that I'd never again put my dreams in a room where they could be priced and rejected by someone who was supposed to love me unconditionally. I didn't argue. Arguing would have meant I still believed the verdict was open to appeal. Instead, I took a small loan from a community lender at a worse rate and picked up night shifts cleaning offices to cover the payments. I signed that lease alone, and for years afterward, every time the work got hard, her sentence played in my head like a song I couldn't switch off. "We can only afford to believe in one of you." For a long time, I thought it was simply cruelty. It turned out to be a budgeting decision. There was exactly one person in my family who never once made me feel like a bad investment. My grandmother, Vivian. My father's mother, a wiry, sharp-eyed woman with a garden that fed half her street. She had opinions about everything except my choices, those she simply trusted. The first week I ran my roadside stand, she drove out, bought the very first loaf I ever sold, and paid me $1 more than I asked because she said I'd undercharged myself. She watched me work for an hour without saying much, then pressed her dry, warm hand against my cheek and gave me the only business advice I've ever kept. "Build it quiet, honey. Loud people need an audience. Builders just need mornings." I understood it years later, every time I watched my sister perform her life for a crowd while I got up in the dark and simply lived mine. Vivian died 5 years ago in her sleep, in the house she'd paid off entirely on a bookkeeper's salary. She left me no money. What she left me was that sentence, and a way of seeing the world I could never unlearn. At her funeral, my mother cried the loudest and stood closest to the casket, and I remember thinking Vivian would have found that about right. My sister's wedding, 12 years ago, remains the clearest picture I have of how our family did its math. Vanessa married Marcus in a rented ballroom with a chandelier, 300 guests, and a cake that cost more than my first 3 months of rent combined. My mother planned it like a coronation and never once used the word budget. I was a bridesmaid in a dress I genuinely couldn't afford, watching my mother glow like she'd finally gotten the daughter the universe owed her. Vanessa wasn't a villain. She was simply a person who'd never once been told no, and people like that develop a particular blindness, a real inability to see the scale they're standing on. Over the years, she got comfortable accepting help that never got acknowledged again, a vacation my parents just wanted to treat them to, a down payment gift nobody spoke of afterward. And she got comfortable performing, narrating her life in updates designed purely to be admired. So when my mother said Vanessa had big news for Christmas, I could already picture it. The photos passed hand to hand, the gasps, the toast. I assumed it was the house. Vanessa had been hinting online for weeks about manifesting our forever home. What I couldn't have guessed was that the dream house wasn't the flex it looked like. It was a debt wearing a bow, and I was about to learn exactly whose name was signed on the ribbon. By that Christmas week, I had built a life I was genuinely proud of, and almost no one in my family had seen a square foot of it. I own my building outright. I own my farmhouse and the 28 acres around it. The final note paid off the previous spring. I had 7 employees, a wholesale contract with 2 regional grocers, and a marriage to a man who fixed things instead of breaking them. On paper, I was the most stable person in my entire family. In my family's story, I was the one who never landed. I didn't hide my life out of shame. I hid it because every time I let them get close, they found a new way to make me smaller, and it was simply easier to keep the door shut. That was my weakness, not that I trusted them too much, but that I'd stopped trusting them almost entirely and started calling it peace. So I made my plan the way I make everything carefully. I'd bring 2 pies, smile, admire the big announcement, and not perform my own success, because performance is my sister's language, not mine. One evening, one smile, then home. What I didn't know, loading those pies into the truck, was that my father had already driven out to my bakery 2 days earlier and left something on my counter. An envelope I hadn't opened yet, and inside it, the reason the peace I'd built was about to end, whether I wanted it to or not. People love a story where someone gets rich overnight. Mine is not that story. Mine took 13 years, and most of them were quietly unremarkable, the part nobody ever wants to film. The early years were the roadside stand, then the storefront I signed for a loan at 23, the one with the leaking roof I patched myself between customers. I lived above the shop for a while, in 2 rooms that permanently smelled of cinnamon, and every spare dollar went straight back into the business. At 28, I bought the farmhouse and the surrounding acreage from a couple retiring out of state, at a price that only made sense because the property was falling apart. I fixed it room by room, one winter at a time, and grew the orchard from bare root saplings that took years to finally bear fruit. The wholesale contracts came slowly, each one requiring months of reliable delivery before they'd trust me with a serious order. There were seasons I didn't take a paycheck. A hailstorm flattened a summer's crop, a walk-in cooler failed on the hottest weekend of the year. I kept meticulous books because Grandma Vivian had been a bookkeeper, and I'd inherited her conviction that numbers never lie if you don't ask them to. And the previous spring, in the plainest moment of my adult life, I sat at my kitchen table and paid off the final loan on the property. No celebration, I just wrote the check, mailed it, and went back to work. That was the fortune my family never saw, because I'd never once invited them to look. Ethan came into my life the way most good things do, through work. A carpenter, I hired him 5 years ago to reframe the sagging roof on my equipment shed. He showed up on time, did what he said he'd do, and noticed the same small details I noticed, which is rarer than it sounds. We married in my own backyard 2 summers ago, under the oldest apple tree on the property, with 9 people present. A judge who was also a regular customer, 2 of my employees, Ethan's brother and sister-in-law, and my friend Renee, who'd loaned me a stand mixer in year 2 and never let me forget it. I didn't invite my family. I didn't hide Ethan from anyone, I simply stopped inviting people to come laugh. I knew exactly how the news would land. The raised eyebrow, the well, isn't that sudden? The questions about what Ethan did for work that were really questions about what he earned. I'd built one clean, happy thing, and I couldn't bear handing it over to be appraised and found lacking, like everything else. So we stood under the tree, and ate a pie I'd baked that morning instead of a tiered cake, and it was the best day of my life precisely because not one person in it had ever made me feel like a long shot. My family found out I was married months later, second-hand, through a cousin. My mother's reaction, relayed back to me, was that she was hurt not to have been included. She had never once asked to be. My sister called me a week before Christmas, which she never does, and the strangeness of it put me on guard before she'd even said hello. She was breezy, asking how I'd been. Then, gently, she circled toward the point. "So how's the little bakery doing? Still busy? You must clear a decent amount around the holidays." I gave her nothing real, just we keep busy, while she fished for more. "It's just so smart what you do," she went on, in a tone that had never once called it smart before. "Steady, no big overhead, not like some people have." My sister had never in her life asked a genuinely curious question about my business. She was asking now, the way you check a couch cushion for loose change. When I hung up, I turned the phrases over. "Steady, no big overhead. You must clear a decent amount." Those weren't the words of a sister catching up. They were the words of someone doing math about me, and people in my family only did math about you when they wanted something. I made a mental note of it, the way you note a hairline crack in a support beam, and the invitations kept a rivy. NG, warmer with every passing day, until I started to feel like I was being carefully set up for something whose edges I still couldn't quite see. My mother's tone shifted that same week. She called again, unprompted, and her sweetness set my teeth on edge. You should bring some of your baking for the table. You always were so good with your hands. In 35 years, I couldn't remember her ever complimenting me without a criticism riding shotgun. Sure, I said. Wonderful, she said. Whole family under one roof. Whole family, like a favor she was extending, when for years I'd been the piece of the family she conveniently edited out of the picture. A day later, my Aunt Dana texted out of nowhere, and it told me more than any phone call could. So happy you finally found someone. Your mom says he's very handy. I'd been married 2 years, but in the family's version, I'd finally found someone, a phrasing that quietly turned a deliberate fact into a rescue narrative. Poor Nora, saved at last. I typed 3 replies and deleted them all. Correcting gossip is like arguing with weather, you just get soaked and it keeps raining. So I wrote back, "Thank you, Dana," and left it there. Silence had always been my move, my one reliable defense against a family that turned every honest word into ammunition. What I hadn't reckoned with was that silence only protects you until the day it stops being dignity and starts being consent. That day was 48 hours away, and it would arrive in a plain manila envelope, carried by the last person I ever expected. My father drove out to the bakery 2 days before Christmas, something he'd done exactly 0 times in all the years I'd owned it. He stood in the doorway in his old canvas coat, holding his hat in both hands like a man at a graveside. "Dad," I said, "is everything okay?" He walked to the counter and set a plain envelope down, sliding it toward me with 2 fingers, like it weighed more than paper should. "You should know what you're walking into," he said. That was the entire sentence. My father had built a career out of saying nothing in my mother's kitchen, and here he was, saying the truest thing he'd said to me in years. "What is this?" For the first time I could remember, his eyes were wet. "It's what your mother didn't want you to see. I'm tired of watching it, Nora. I've been tired for a long time." Then he put his hat back on, told me he'd see me at dinner, and walked out before I could say another word. I waited until closing. Alone in my quiet shop, ovens ticking as they cooled, I slid the papers out under the one light I'd left burning. Financial paperwork, printed at home, ink slightly faded. The first page was a home equity line of credit in my parents' names, drawn against the house I grew up in. The second, a co-signer agreement, my mother's signature beside my sister's on a mortgage for a 5-bedroom house on the good side of town. The third was a bank statement, and it stopped my breath entirely. My parents had withdrawn a large sum from that equity line the previous spring, and a matching withdrawal had come out of a retirement account the same week. Both, according to the memo lines my father had circled in pencil, funneled toward the down payment on Vanessa's dream house. The dates lined up like dominoes. My mother had drained her retirement and mortgaged her paid-off home to make my sister look like she'd arrived. The very same season, I mailed the final check on a farm I'd built with no help from anyone. Her voice came back across 11 years, clear as the day she'd said it. "We can only afford to believe in one of you." It had never been about affordability. She'd found plenty to spend. It had only ever been about which daughter she decided to spend it on. I sat very still, dry-eyed and steady, folded the papers back into the envelope, tucked it into my coat, and turned off the light. I didn't sleep much, but not for the reason you'd expect. I wasn't planning revenge. I was arguing with myself over whether to do anything at all because I could still choose quiet. I was very good at quiet. I could walk into that dinner, eat the ham, admire the house, drive home, and carry that envelope to my grave, and nothing in my comfortable, hard-won life would ever have to change. That was the safe move. But something had shifted, and it took me nearly until morning to name it. For 13 years, I'd told myself my silence was strength. Reading those numbers, I understood it had also been the exact thing that let the story keep running. Every time I stayed quiet, my mother got to keep selling the version where she couldn't afford to help me, where I was the risk that never paid off. My silence had been signing off on the lie, year after year. Ethan found me at the kitchen table before dawn, cold coffee in front of me. He sat down and didn't reach for the envelope. "You don't owe them a scene," he said quietly. "But you don't owe them your lens either." I decided I wasn't going to walk in swinging, wasn't going to make a speech or ambush anyone or ruin Christmas on principle. But if they put me on the stage the way they always did, this year I wasn't going to swallow it. If they pushed, I was going to tell the truth. Just once. Just the truth, laid out plainly. Christmas morning, I did what I always do when bracing for something difficult. I baked 2 pies, apple from my own trees and bourbon pecan. Ethan loaded them into the truck while I got dressed, and I stood at the mirror longer than I needed to. I wasn't dressing to impress anyone. I was dressing like a woman who owned her own building, which looks a lot like a good sweater and clean boots. I felt the envelope settle against my ribs like a stone I'd chosen to carry on purpose. "You okay?" Ethan asked. "I'm not going over there to win. I'm going over there to stop losing." He nodded because that made sense. On the drive across the county, the fields lay bare and silver with frost, and I ran through the plan one final time. I would be warm. I would let my mother have her toast and my sister have her house. I would say nothing about the envelope unless they forced my hand, and if they did, I would stay perfectly calm. A loud daughter is a daughter you get to dismiss, and I intended never to be dismissed again. We turned onto my parents' street, cars already lining the curb, and I put the truck in park, reminding myself I only needed one honest sentence. My parents' house was decorated the way it always is at Christmas, tasteful and a little breathless, every surface insisting we are doing wonderfully, in case anyone was keeping score. The whole extended family was there, and at the center of it, holding court by the mantel, my sister Vanessa and her husband Marcus. A stack of glossy photographs was already circling the room, hand to hand. The dream house. Vanessa gave a little finger wave, the wave you give the help. My mother swept over, took the pies from my hands, and steered me in by the elbow. "Everyone, Nora's here," she announced, still figuring things out, but she brought her little pies. Isn't that sweet? Still figuring things out. 2 years married, 28 acres paid in full, and I was introduced as a work in progress with a nice hobby. I felt Ethan go rigid beside me and put a hand on his arm. Not yet, not here. The needling began before we'd even sat down, small enough that objecting would make me look oversensitive. My mother never properly introduced Ethan. Half the room spent the evening unsure who he even was. Vanessa drifted over with her wine. "You look well," she said, in the tone you'd use on someone recovering from an illness. "Still selling muffins at the market, sweetie." She'd already turned to describe her new kitchen to a cousin, the island, the double ovens, the guest suite. "So if anyone's ever in a tight spot," she said, looking right at me, "there's always a place to land." Marcus chimed in about the neighborhood and the property appreciation, throwing numbers around with the confidence of a man who's never made the payment himself. I took it the way I always had, a small, closed smile, a sip of water. But this year I had an envelope against my ribs that turned every one of Marcus's confident numbers into a private joke, because I already knew where the real numbers had come from. I watched my mother beam at her golden couple, and understood I was the only person in that room who knew the true price of the performance we were all watching. It made me remarkably calm. Vanessa cornered me in the kitchen before dinner, and the mask slipped so fast it nearly gave me whiplash. She pulled the swinging door half shut behind her, what people do when they're about to say something they don't want witnessed. "So listen," she said, the breezy performance gone. "Things are a little stretched right now with the house. Marcus's bonus didn't come through and the mortgage is, well, it's a lot." She laughed thin. "Mom mentioned you've actually done pretty well for yourself out there." There it was, the fishing call, the sudden compliments, all of it finally landing on the counter between us. "I was thinking maybe you could help us out. Invest in the house. Family helps family, right?" I stood there holding a pie server, looking at my sister, who'd spent 35 years watching our mother refuse me a signature, now asking me to bankroll the very house that refusal had helped make possible. "How much are we talking about?" The number she named would have covered my entire first storefront twice over. "It's just temporary," she added, "until things turn around." "I'll think about it," I said, precisely what my mother always said right before she said no. Vanessa's face relaxed, mistaking it for a yes. My mother came into the kitchen a minute later, the timing far too clean to be an accident. She picked up a serving spoon and fussed with potatoes that didn't need fussing. "Did your sister talk to you about the house?" I said she had. "It would mean a lot," my mother said, not looking at me. "It's the least you could do for your sister. She has real responsibilities now, a mortgage, a family to think about. You've only got yourself and the bakery." As if the life I'd built was smaller than the debt my sister had purchased. Underneath it all was the old sentence in a new coat. 11 years earlier it had been, We can only afford to believe in one of you. Tonight it's the least you could do. Same accounting, same daughter on the losing side of the ledger, except now that I'd quietly become solvent, I was suddenly useful again. My mother finally looked up, her eyes carrying that soft, expectant warmth she saved for the moment she was already certain she'd won. Family takes care of family, Nora. Yes, I said quietly. I've noticed exactly how that works in this family. Something flickered across her face, a small crack there and gone. She didn't understand yet. She was about to. I asked Vanessa and my mother to step onto the back porch with me, away from the crowd, because whatever else I am, I'm not cruel, and I wanted to give them the chance to hear my no in private first. The cold hit us as the door swung shut. I'm not going to lend you the money, I said. No anger, no lecture, just the fact laid down plainly. Vanessa's face crumpled. Are you serious? We're family. We are, and I hope the house works out. But I'm not going to prop up a mortgage payment on a property I have nothing to do with. And I think you already know that, or you wouldn't have asked me in a kitchen with the door half shut. My mother's warmth vanished like a light switching off. After everything this family has done for you, she started. Then lower, don't you dare make a scene about this at the table. Not tonight. And there it was, the tell. My mother wasn't afraid of my no. She was afraid of what I might say if I stopped being quiet. She knew, somewhere beneath the performance, exactly what I might have in my possession. I looked at her in the porch light, this woman who'd spent a lifetime managing our family's story, and understood, for the first time, that she was genuinely afraid of me. I went back inside, and for a little while it looked almost like a normal Christmas dinner, if you didn't know what was humming underneath the table. The ham came out, then the potatoes, and my 2 pies sat on the sideboard like polite afterthoughts. Ethan found my hand beneath the tablecloth and held it. I could feel my mother watching me from the head of the table, calculating whether her warning on the porch had landed. Vanessa had recovered her performance and was describing crown molding to a cousin. From the outside, it looked exactly like a family. I ate a little, complimented the ham, which was genuinely good, because whatever else is true about my mother, she has always been able to cook. And the whole time, I felt the envelope inside my coat and waited, because I'd decided one thing on that porch. I would not pick up the knife first. But if my mother stood up and did what she always did, put me on stage one more time to make my sister shine brighter by contrast, I was done swallowing it, and everyone in that room was going to hear something true. My mother tapped her wine glass with her fork, and the table fell quiet, and she rose to deliver the toast. I set down my fork and folded my hands. I just want to say, she began, how blessed I am to have my family all together, and I have some wonderful news to share. She paused for effect, the way she always does. Your sister and Marcus have just bought their dream house. The table erupted right on cue. My aunt clapped. My cousins made the sounds people make. Vanessa pressed a hand to her chest and did her modest little laugh, and Marcus lifted his glass like a man accepting an award he'd purchased himself. My mother beamed down the length of the table, drinking in every second of it. And then, because one triumph is never quite enough for her, she turned the spotlight where she always turns it. She looked at me, warm and pitying, and said, and of course, we're all still waiting on our Nora to figure out her life. A few uncomfortable chuckles rippled around the table. Then Vanessa, flushed with wine and applause, twisted the knife with a smile, leaning toward me so the whole room could enjoy it. So, she said sweetly, when are you finally going to settle down? There it was, the question they'd been asking me in one form or another for over a decade, delivered this time as the punchline to my sister's victory lap, in front of every single relative I had. Every face at that table turned toward me, some amused, some faintly embarrassed, all of them waiting to watch me shrink the way I always did. I felt Ethan's hand tighten around mine, I felt the envelope against the back of my chair, and I felt for tea. He first time in years, completely calm. I set my glass down gently, so it wouldn't make a sound, and I smiled at my sister, a real smile, because the moment had finally arrived and I found I wasn't afraid of it after all. I already did, I said. The table waited, not yet understanding. I already settled down, I went on, my voice quiet, and even the same voice I use when I'm telling a customer a price, and I know it's fair. I just didn't invite people who never believed in me. For a second, nobody moved. Then the questions started, small and confused, and I answered them plainly, one at a time, without ever raising my voice. "This is my husband, Ethan," I said, resting my hand on his shoulder. "We've been married 2 years. We got married under the apple tree behind my farmhouse." My mother's smile had frozen solid. "Your farmhouse," she repeated. "My farmhouse," I said. 28 acres, and a house I bought at 28 and finished paying off last spring. I own the bakery building outright too. I have 7 employees and contracts with 2 grocery chains. I wasn't bragging, I was reciting facts, flat and factual, the way you read from a deed. I've been married for 2 years and running a business for 13, and tonight this family introduced me as someone still figuring things out. The room had gone completely silent, the specific silence that settles in when a story everyone believed turns out to be wrong. My aunt's fork hung suspended over her plate. My cousins studied their laps. Vanessa's mouth opened and closed twice without producing a single word. My mother stood at the head of the table, glass still in hand, staring at me as though I'd suddenly begun speaking a language she hadn't known I could speak. I hadn't shouted. I hadn't cried. I had simply told the truth. And in a family built on a carefully managed story, the truth landed like a dropped plate. My mother recovered the way a fire recovers when you open a door. Her face went from white to red, and she set her glass down hard enough to slosh wine across the tablecloth. "How dare you," she said, her voice already climbing. "How dare you turn your sister's night into some performance about yourself?" The irony of the word performance, from her, at her own carefully staged toast, was almost too rich to bear. But I said nothing. "You've always been like this," she went on, louder, gesturing while the relatives sat frozen. "Selfish, cold, you disappear for years, don't even invite your own mother to your wedding, and now you show up to embarrass this family." She was crying now, the fast, furious tears I'd watched my entire life, the kind that always arrived exactly when she was losing control of a room. "After everything your father and I have done for you, this is how you repay us." I let her go. I didn't interrupt, didn't defend myself, because something had finally become clear that I wished I'd understood at 23. The louder she got, the smaller her argument became, and everyone at that table could see it happening in real time. For 35 years, my mother had been the calm one, and I'd been the disappointment squirming under her verdict. Now she was coming apart at the head of the table, and I sat perfectly still, and there was nothing she could say that would put the room back the way it had been. "After everything you've done for me," I repeated softly, once she'd finally run out of air. "Let's actually talk about that." I reached back into my coat, took out the envelope, and set it on the table in front of me, unopened, where everyone could see it. I didn't wave it around. I just laid it down the way you set down a card you'd been holding all night. "Mom," I said, "for 13 years you've told this family a story that you couldn't afford to help me, that Vanessa was the sensible one and I was the risk. When I was 23, I brought you a business plan and asked you to co-sign a loan, and you told me, and I have never once forgotten the words, that you could only afford to believe in one of us." A few relatives shifted in their seats. My aunt looked toward my mother. "I never asked you for another thing after that," I went on. "I built everything I have without a single dollar from this family, and I would have kept quiet about all of it tonight, the way I always have, except that Vanessa asked me in the kitchen an hour ago to bail out her mortgage, and you followed her in to tell me it was the least I could do." My mother had gone very still. "So I think the family should know," I said, and I put 2 fingers on the envelope. "What's actually holding up your daughter's dream house?" I told them about the home equity line drawn against my parents' paid-off house. I told them about the retirement account emptied the very same week, and the co-signature on Vanessa's mortgage. I told them the down payment on that 5-bedroom house had come out of my mother's retirement savings and my father's future. The same spring I had quietly mailed the final check on a farm I'd built entirely with my own 2 hands. "You always had the money," I said, my voice never once rising. "You just spent it on the daughter you'd already decided to believe in." Vanessa made a small, strangled sound. Marcus set down his fork. The silence that followed had genuine weight to it, and for once it wasn't sitting on my side of the table. Here's the part I'm proudest of. I did not gloat. I had the whole table's attention. I had the truth. I had my mother speechless for the first time in living memory, and I felt no pull at all to twist the knife further. Winning that way would have made me a smaller version of them, and I had worked far too hard to become someone else entirely. So I folded my hands on the table and spoke gently, to the whole room and to no one in particular. I'm not saying any of this to collect a debt, I said. Nobody in this family owes me money. I'm saying it because I'm done paying in silence, and silence is genuinely the only thing I've ever given any of you. I turned to Vanessa, whose eyes had gone glassy. I'm not going to fund the house, I told her. But if you want real help, I'll sit down with you and go through the actual numbers honestly, without Mom in the room, and figure out whether it's even a house you can realistically keep. That's help. Writing a check just to keep a lie standing isn't. Then I looked at my mother. I didn't come here tonight to hurt you, I said, and I meant it. I came to stop being the story you tell so everyone else can feel chosen. I'm not that person. I never was. I just let you say I was, and that's on me. And it stops now. My mother opened her mouth, and for one strange second I thought an actual apology might finally arrive, the first of my life. Instead, she said, in a wounded whisper, that I'd ruined Christmas, that I'd always been jealous of my sister, that she didn't know where she'd gone wrong with me. I nodded slowly. It was, at least, honest. It was exactly who she was. I stood up, not fast, not dramatic, just the way you rise when a meal is finished. Ethan stood with me. I looked down the table at all of them, the frozen cousins, my crying mother, my sister staring at her plate, and felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, just quiet. My father caught my eye and gave me the smallest possible nod, and I understood that whatever it had cost him to drive that envelope out to my shop, he did not regret it. I nodded back. It said more than the last decade of dinners combined. The pies are on the sideboard, I said to the room evenly. Apples from my own trees, help yourselves. I picked up my coat, the envelope tucked safely back inside it, and put my hand on Ethan's arm. At the doorway I stopped and turned, because there was one more thing I wanted to leave behind, and I wanted to leave it gently. Merry Christmas, I said, looking directly at my mother. I mean that, I really do. Then we walked out into the cold, and the door closed behind us on a silence I had waited half my life to finally hear. I didn't slow down to listen for whatever came next. For once, whatever they said about me after I left was none of my business. The days that followed were quieter than I expected, and stranger. My Aunt Dana called first, 2 days later, and apologized, said she'd spent years hearing only one side of my story and never once thought to ask for the other. She asked if she could come see the farm. I said yes. 2 of my cousins drove out that week and bought bread like it was any ordinary shop, except they lingered, and I could see them quietly rewriting the story they'd been handed. Word came secondhand that Vanessa and Marcus put the dream house back on the market before spring, because the numbers had never worked. I felt no joy in it, just gravity doing what gravity does to something built on a bluff. My own life didn't change at all, which was, in a way, the point. The oven still needed lighting at 4:30. The orchard still needed pruning. The only real difference was that I no longer carried my family's story around in my chest like a stone. I'd set it down on that table and left it there. My father drove out to the farm alone in January, turning his hat over in his hands, and told me the thing he'd never managed to say in 35 years. I watched her do it your whole life, and I told myself it wasn't my place. That was cowardice, Nora. I let him say it, then poured him coffee and told him the truth right back. I'm glad you finally did, and I forgive you, but an apology opens a door it doesn't move you back in. We start from here. Slow. He stayed for an hour, and it was the best hour we'd had together in years. My mother took a different road, long messages about how hurt she was, how I'd humiliated her, how the family was fractured now and it was my doing. I read them and didn't fight them. I simply stopped explaining myself the way I always had, except this time the silence wasn't hiding anything. It was a boundary. There's a difference, and I finally know it. If there's one thing I'd want you to take from my story, it's this. The people who never once bet on you don't get to cash in on the life you built without them. Walking out of a room with your name still your own is the only trophy that never loses its value. I spent 13 years believing my silence was strength, when really it was just the quietest way of agreeing with people who were wrong about me. The day I finally stopped agreeing, I didn't get louder. I just, at last, got free. That's my story. One envelope, one quiet answer, and a table that finally had to sit with the truth. If you've ever been the long shot in your own family, let this be your reminder. Build it quiet, keep your books clean, and let the truth do the talking when its moment finally comes. If this story reached you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Thank you for being here. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.